Fellas, today we're going to be taking a look at UFC events in modern UFC that are really dead or just really bad pay-per-views, or maybe fight nights, just events that didn't go the way we expected them to, or they just weren't stacked at all, or pay-per-views or fight nights that were just terrible, and ones that you just want to skip and get onto the next event. We're going to be taking a look at some modern examples, and I said modern UFC because if we were to do all time, this video would probably go on forever, so I'm going to narrow it down to modern events. And yeah, please let me know if you agree with some of these events or if I missed any events out. But yeah, we're going to get straight in there with UFC 293. It's not even happened yet, but I've got to include it on this list. It's happening this weekend. It's a really bad pay-per-view. It's one of the worst pay-per-views we've had in recent time. I don't know why UFC, I think it's in New Zealand or Australia. I don't know why they decided to go back down there when we've literally just had UFC 290, which had, who did it have when it had Alexander Volkanovski, it had Robert Whittaker on there. They could, I don't know why they decided to waste all the New Zealand Australian fighters on UFC 290 when they knew that they had an Australian pay-per-view coming up. That didn't really make any sense. So now we've got Adesanya, who doesn't even know where he's from. We've got Taito Ivaza, who I guess is New Zealand, and they've got a couple of New Zealand Australian prospects on there. But the card overall is really dead. The main event is very uncompetitive. Let's be honest. The press conference should be pay-per-view. Adesanya is going to walk through Strickland. Hopefully Strickland can do anything to beat Adesanya because that would be great, but I just don't see it happening. I see this being one of Adesanya's more easier fights he's had recently. He's just come off a fight with Pereira where he knocked him out, and now he's got to fight Strickland, who also got knocked out by Pereira, so I think Adesanya takes care of him pretty easily. The co-main event, it's a good fight. I've got Volkov winning. It's a good fight, but that's just the most bog standard fight night headliner. You take away the Adesanya versus Strickland fight, and it's nothing more than a fight night. It's just a basic fight night if you take away the Adesanya versus Strickland headliner. The co-main event, like I said, it's a good fight, good matchmaking, but it's just a fight night headliner. And then the featured fight is very weak. We were supposed to have Kai Kara France. He's not even taking part anymore because he's got injured. So now we have Manel Kape versus Dos Santos. And Dos Santos isn't even ranked in the flyweight division. So it's Manel Kape versus an unranked fighter. And then every other fighter unranked fighters in the main card. So it's just not great. We've only got 2 fights that contain ranked fighters and obviously Manel Kape. It's just not a good card at all. If you're Australian, I can kind of see why it's good because it's just full of Australian fighters. And I already made a video not long ago on why UFC 293 is bad, but it's only gone worse from here. I really expected UFC to kind of add an extra fight to this. Like, for pay-per-view, how much does this cost in America? I don't think anyone wants to buy this. They should have added an extra fight. Jack Della Maddalena versus, what's his name? Kevin Holland. Stick that on this card. I know Jack Della Maddalena might not be ready yet, and I think he just fought. My mic's messing up. Kevin Holland just fought, but still, stick it on the card. Get any fight on this card because it's terrible. It's terrible. You will raise the main event and it's a fight night. No one's paying $80 just to watch Adesanya versus Strickland. So I'm going to go with UFC 293 this weekend. It's a terrible pay-per-view. Next up, probably the worst pay-per-view we've had in the entire year, UFC 289. This was horrible. It was an absolutely dreadful card. It was one of those cards that we just wanted to just get out of the way so then we could have UFC 290. It is just an average fight night at best if you take away the Oliveira fight. Like, the whole hype around this card was Oliveira versus Dariush. Nunes versus Pena 3 didn't even manage to happen because that was at least Nunes versus Pena 3, they had beef. It would have kind of had meaning whoever won, and it would have been an interesting trilogy. Nunes versus Aldana, no one really wanted to see that. There was nothing there. It was just another fight. Obviously, Oliveira versus Dariush carried the card. If it wasn't for that, it'd be an average fight night at best. A women's main event as well. UFC, I know they've started doing women main event fight nights now, but I hope that they stop doing women's main event for pay-per-view. No one's paying $80 to watch a women's main event, and this isn't me trying to be against women MMA. Listen, I think women title fights should 100% be headliners for fight nights. I love that idea, but for a pay-per-view over Oliveira, I completely disagree. And yeah, it just wasn't a good card. Look under the Oliveira fight, just full of no one's there to sell a pay-per-view. You've got UFC 291, Tony Ferguson on the main card. Look who's on the main card for UFC 289. It's terrible, not stacked at all. Just wasn't a great fight. Just wasn't a great pay-per-view at all. Yeah, probably the worst pay-per-view we've had in the entire year so far. Even UFC 293, I'd say is better than this because at least then we had Adesanya Strickland and Taito Ivalza versus Volkov. The fights themselves were alright. I guess Oliveira finished Dariush and Nunes absolutely battered Aldana and then retired, but still, UFC 289 has to go down in the history books for being one of the worst pay-per-views we've had recently, and I think we can all agree because all I saw was hate for this card, and I understand why. It wasn't great at all. So next up, we're going to go UFC 272. It wasn't as bad as UFC 289, but it wasn't stacked at all. I mean, there was no title fight, and I'm not saying there needs to be a title fight for a pay-per-view to be good. I mean, we just had UFC 280, UFC 291, which I guess it was the BMF belt, but I'm not counting that as a title fight. It was just a pretty uneventful main event. There was so much hype going into it with Masvidal and Covington. All that trash talk. They were even trash talking in the octagon. And all that really happened was Colby Covington just wrestling Masvidal as expected. Because Masvidal, his wrestling isn't the greatest. He's got okay takedown defense, but his grappling hasn't really improved too much. So it was just Covington wrestling Masvidal and then the occasional striking bout. So it was quite an uneventful main event. The featured, I'll give it, Dos Anjos versus Moicano was really, really fun. I'll give him that. Barboza versus Mitchell, again, it was just really boring. It was just Mitchell holding down Barboza for the entire fight. It just wasn't that stacked either for a pay-per-view. You look at the pay-per-view, at this time, Sergey Spivak wasn't a big name, and he just ragdolled Greg Hardy. There wasn't much big names on the card. You look at it now, and there's a lot of big names, but that's because they've grown as stars. But at the time of UFC 272, it was like, early 2022, it just wasn't that stacked for a pay-per-view. It weren't that stacked. And there was only 5 finishes on the entire card, which for a pay-per-view is quite poor. Or just a card in general, only having 5 finishes, it wasn't that great. It was kind of one of those pay-per-views where it was alright, better than a fight night, but it just wasn't a great pay-per-view. Like I said, at the time, no one knew who Spivak were. Holland was still a growing star. Bryce Mitchell versus Barboza was boring. The main event was kind of boring. There was no title fight on it, so nothing really switched after this fight. So I'm gonna go UFC 272 for being one of the worst pay-per-views we have had in time. Next up, I've got UFC 282, which is exactly 10 pay-per-views later. Yeah, this one wasn't great. I feel like UFC during this era was at a really low point. I kind of lost interest with UFC when this era of pay-per-views were happening between UFC 282 and 283. But we were robbed of the Yuri Prohaska versus Glover Teixeira match. Yuri versus Glover 1 was one of the best UFC fights I think I've ever seen. People say to me, or people say in the MMA community, if there was one fight you could show a non-MMA fan to convince them to be an MMA fan, what would you show them? And I'd show them Yuri versus Glover 1. I was so excited for that rematch to take place because it was going to be so interesting, and the match just got called off. The main event was called off, and they decided, yep, let's just have the card as normal. And the main event was a robbery. It wasn't even that eventful either. It was quite an uneventful main event, and it was a robbery, and Kalaev should have won. So the belt had to stay vacant. So again, there was no title change or anything. Pimlet versus Gordon. Paddy Pimlet and Jared Gordon, neither of them should be co-main event in an entire pay-per-view. They weren't even main eventing fight nights. I don't know how he's managed to go from co-main event in a pay-per-view. And it was a robbery as well. That's the main takeaway from the card. Paddy Pimlet robbed Jared Gordon, which was, I don't know why UFC thought Paddy Pimlet would be a good co-main event. They should have done, I don't know. It just wasn't that great of a pay-per-view. Darren Till let us down again as well. We were supposed to see Darren Till return after all that grappling with Hamzat Chimaev. We were supposed to see him return against Dricus du Plessis, and Dricus du Plessis just ran through him. And I guess that win kind of aged well because Dricus du Plessis is in a very good spot in his career now. He's going to be fighting for a belt soon. But still, Darren Till let us down. Still had no heart in him. The Topuria versus Mitchell fight was fun. The Ponzinibbio versus Moreno fight, I guess, was fun, but the overall card wasn't great. Again, no title change, wasn't stacked. Pimlet as a co-main event, multiple robberies. Yeah, this card wasn't great. This card wasn't great. I think this was the last pay-per-view of the year as well, and it just wasn't a great way to end the year. In my opinion, we should be ending the year on a banger. I mean, we've got UFC 296 this year, and so far it's looking to be stacked, and this just wasn't stacked at all. So UFC 282 is going to go as one of the worst pay-per-views, and next up we got UFC 270. To have 2 title fights on a card and it be this bad, it was criminal. Francis Ngannou versus Cyril Gane was supposed to be an insane fight. We had Francis Ngannou, the scary knockout puncher, coming off a knockout win over Stipe Miocic. We had undefeated Cyril Gane, one of the most elusive, one of the most athletic strikers in UFC history. We expected this to be a striking battle, and it just wasn't. Francis Ngannou just wrestled Cyril Gane the entire time, slammed him a couple times, laid on him, and to be honest, that's what I expected Sergey Spivak to do to Cyril Gane. I'm not going to go into that fight now, but yeah, it just wasn't that fun of a main event. We were supposed to have an insane striking matchup, and it was just grappling the entire fight. It wasn't much striking at all, besides an occasional body kick from Cyril Gane. Yeah, he just wasn't that fun. I was expecting it to be a lot funner. In the co-main event, Moreno versus Figueiredo was their trilogy. We'd already seen him twice before, and Moreno lost the belt. I don't know anyone who really wanted Figueiredo to win that fight because, listen, no hate on Figueiredo, but unless you're a Moreno hater or you're a Brazilian, I don't know anyone that would want Moreno to lose to Figueiredo. And there was literally 5 finishes on the entire card. Again, an entire card, and there was only 5 finishes on the entire thing. It was just a weak card. I mean, besides the Moreno fight, the main event wasn't that stacked either. I mean, we had Michael Pereira. It just wasn't that stacked at all. I mean, look at the people on the main event. Even on the prelims, it weren't that stacked. I mean, we had Jack Della Maddalena, but at the time, he wasn't really a big name. Yeah, it wasn't a great pay-per-view, especially for the fact that it had 2 title fights on it, and it should have been a little bit more stacked than this, in my opinion. They should have at least added one more big fight to it, but it was what it was. It was kind of, I guess we got to see 2 title changes, but, well, we didn't see 2 title changes. Ngannou kept the belt and Moreno lost it, but still, regardless, UFC 270, it wasn't a great pay-per-view. Now we're going to go on to fight nights. Now there's 2 fight nights for me that stand out. I'm probably missing them because fight nights are commonly kind of bad. But there's 2 that stand out. First of all, a very recent fight night we've had in July. Aspinall versus Tabora. UFC London in March of 2022 was one of the best fight nights of all time. And it felt like Aspinall versus Tabora was the complete opposite. It was really boring. The entire card throughout was really boring. There was no Paddy Pimblett on it this time. A lot of the names, there was no Arnold Allen. A lot of the names from the old UFC Londons were on it. I mean, the prelims were really, really boring. Pretty much every single fight on the prelim was a boring fight. I've already gone over the card, but yeah, it was just a really boring set of prelims. I mean, you've just seen UFC Paris, where a lot of the fights were fun, or at least some of the fights were fun, and the crowd were going wild. The crowd weren't that good at this fight besides the main event. A lot of boring prelims. Even the main card was quite boring. Lerone Murphy versus Josh Cooleybow was extremely boring. Jai Herbert versus Faraz Ziam was boring. I guess every other fight on the main event was main card was somewhat interesting. We had Paul Craig managed to latch up a win over Andre Muniz. Wood versus Philly was a fun fight. McCann versus Storyalenko, we get to see McCann lose, and obviously Aspinall versus Tabora. But there was multiple bad ref moments and robberies as well. Yeah, there's just a bunch of robberies throughout the entire fight. Obviously, the time when Mark Jacasey, I think he was a headbutt. I think it was either an eye poke or a headbutt, and the ref just didn't stop the fight at all. That was a bad call. We had Davy Grant versus Marcos. Davy Grant should have won that fight. That was a robbery. So there was multiple bad ref moments and robberies on the entire card, and it had such high expectations because UFC London, like I said, has a reputation of doing pretty well. But this card, it was very boring. The main card had a few good fights in it, but apart from that, it was just a boring fight night. I'm going to be honest, it had high expectations. I'm glad Aspinall versus Tabora was a fun fight, but everything else on the card, I had more high expectations for. I thought it was going to be a banger in London, but it just wasn't. So I'm going to go with UFC Fight Night, Aspinall versus Tabora. And finally, again, quite a recent fight night. It happened this year. Vera versus Sandhagen. I mean, first of all, look how many fights are on this card. There was not much fights. I mean, yeah, this fight card just wasn't stacked with fight nights at all. It just wasn't that fun. It was a boring main event. 3 finishes on the entire card. I mean, it just really wasn't great. Sandhagen versus Vera, kind of like Francis Ngannou versus Cyril Gane. It was supposed to be this interesting matchup between 2 strikers, and Sandhagen took him down the entire fight. Sandhagen's kind of turned into a boring fighter recently, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing because I guess it is winning him fights, but he is kind of turning into a boring fighter, and this main event was quite boring. there was 3 finishes on the entire card, and I know that the card wasn't as big as normal cards, but there was 3 finishes. It felt like the event was over very quickly. And I say the main event didn't really mean anything because Sandhagen just lost. I mean, just beat Vera. And yet Vera is still going to be fighting for the belt. That doesn't make sense. Sandhagen's only won, and he's beaten Vera. Vera lost to Sandhagen and beat Munoz, and he's going to be fighting for a belt. So it seems like this fight should not have just shouldn't have happened because it didn't really mean anything. Like Sandhagen didn't really get rewarded for beating Vera, and Vera didn't really take much or didn't really get anything served to him for losing to Sandhagen. So I'm going to say that Vera versus Sandhagen was a boring fighting night card. Wasn't much fights, and it just wasn't great. So that is my list of the worst UFC events in modern UFC. Please let me know if you agree with any of these or disagree. But yeah, that is my list. Thank you for watching.